This is part 3 of the Pre-Disaster Mitigation Grants Project webinar. Your presenter is Stephen Randolph with FEMA Region 10.
Okay, project application development, quality and complete. Okay, that's what we strive for. Now, I'm talking to you about pulling all the stuff together to file and create your project sub-application. So if you look at this as a 10,000 foot, I'm not going to say 100,000 foot, but I'll say 10,000, maybe even a 2,000 foot. There we go. But not on the ground, okay? Overview. So common application elements. This is your next step. You need to designate an authorized agent. That is done by the tribal board of elders, commission, council, whatever the governing body is of the tribe. That document is signed and uploaded into eGrants. That person then becomes the person who in eGrants is the person we contact with regard to each individual sub-application. They may have us work with other folks that will be implementing the project, but that authorized agent is the person who is empowered to apply for the grant, who is empowered to accept the grant on behalf of the tribe. And as part of establishing that authorized agent, what we have seen is the Tribal Board of Elders or Council will also say, we are committing to meet any necessary match requirements, and we want to apply for this grant. So that's really good to have all of that in there. I'm saying that because that's not something that many people talk about. So another element is, a primary element is the project scope of work. What are you going to do? What does it look like? Where will it be? Then the project work schedule, starting from the time of award, which will vary from project to project depending upon the environmental review. The cost estimate and the budget. The benefit cost analysis to demonstrate the project is cost effective. Compliance with environmental and historic preservation requirements. Historic preservation includes cultural. For those things that the tribe feels comfortable sharing, this is privacy protected. We will work with you very closely. We don't need to know where everything is. You need to tell us whether it needs to be avoided or not, okay? And then the actual grant application forms, which are in eGrants, and but are cool because, I'll take a moment right here because I'm not sure I mentioned this later, you can get, and here's what we recommend, get a blank grant application form, download it out of eGrants, or download it from the FEMA.gov website for eGrants, which is all included in the resource links down at the end. And so you can see what you're going to be filling out. Then do the major narrative elements in a Microsoft Word document, offline. Prepare all that so that you can do spell check, you can organize your thoughts, you can create paragraphs, the whole 9 yards. Why do we recommend that? Well, it's more efficient for all those reasons, number two. But the real reason, eGrants times out after 20 minutes, and you don't necessarily know it's timed out until you click save, and it disappears. So we strongly recommend that you don't try to fill out the narrative parts. Do that beforehand. Do it offline. For example, another thing in the budget, you can fill out the budget in an OMB SF-424 PDF form fill, so that you're all ready, that when you get ready to type it into eGrants, it's much easier. You've already figured everything out. Okay, enough of that. So the project scope of work is a detailed description of the proposed project. The way the questions are worded in eGrants, you have to read really carefully, but it really is asking you, what are you proposing to do? It starts off talking about, why do you need to do this? Well, really, we need to know, what are you proposing to do? That's the most important thing, and that's oftentimes what gets missed in typing in the narrative sections of the eGrants sub-application form. So what is the proposed project? And again, you know, that's a kind of a who, what, why, where kind of thing. What's the place? What's the facility? How are you going to do it? What's it going to look like, etc. Here's where your engineering report of the problem and concept design is crucial, if that's what you're proposing to do. You don't need an engineering report and concept design to do a buyout. You don't even need it to do a flood elevation unless it's for a larger building, like a public safety building, for example, rather than an individual house, because larger structures have more engineering-related problems. So conceptual design would be needed for a larger building. What is the problem to be mitigated? Okay, that's pretty straightforward. We flood. We flood pretty often. We flood pretty deep. Okay, but that needs to be explained. What's the source of flooding? How often does it happen? How deep does it get? That sort of thing. How will your project resolve that problem? Usually that's pretty clear too. Who is affected, i.e. the community, the users of the building, the area that it's located in, etc. Where is it located? We need good maps. For example, if you give us a flood map and say, here's the flood map for the area where our project is, if you don't put X marks the spot, we have not a clue where that building is. Well, nowadays we have a lot better clue thanks to Google Earth and Google Maps, but that's beside the point. Okay, who's performing the work? So let's say, for example, you have a project to do a seismic retrofit of a fire station. You have an engineering design consultant who's going to do the designs. You're going to likely bid it out for a building contractor to do the seismic retrofit. The tribal public works department may do some of the site work. Maybe you need additional stormwater management, and this is a good time to do that. You can add that to the project, to the seismic retrofit project. You can add green infrastructure elements to the project. Okay, so maybe the tribal public works department is going to do that, and guess what? Somebody has to oversee all of this. So there's going to be a person at maybe it's a tribal administrator's office, maybe it's the planning department, maybe it's the public works department, natural resources department. There's going to be one or more people that we call the project managers. And that's something that, by the way, that many people forget to put in their budget is project management. Project management is not managing the grant. Project management is managing the project. Administrative services is managing the grant, the financial aspects of the grant. We'll talk about that again, too. So who's performing the work? How will it be implemented? I know that sounds like, well we're going to, hire a contractor and they're going to come in and build it. This is like more, this is related to the timing and the milestones below. Well, we're going to do the site preparation in November, and then we're going to cover it with a tarp because we don't want it to be damaged during the rainy season. And then that's also a flood-prone season, so we don't want to get too much mess. And then we're going to uncover it, and we're going to do the foundation excavation, and we're going to build the project in the next dry season. Okay, that's the kind of thing. How will it be implemented? Okay, and timelines and milestones. And again, start your timeline after the award. Supporting documentation. Quad sheet, USGS quad sheet, street maps, floodplain maps, aerial photo maps, photos of the site, photos of the building. Really important if you're doing any structures is we need photos if you're doing an elevation or an acquisition or a seismic retrofit of all four sides of the building so that we can appropriately coordinate with the Tribal Historic Preservation Office, or if the tribe doesn't have one, with the State Historic Preservation Office for buildings. Okay, pertinent studies. I really wanted to have in there the consulting engineering design report and study, but I couldn't find one quickly yesterday. We strongly encourage all tribes, all local governments to do a written narrative report about the scope of work and attach that, upload that into eGrants, and then just do very basic answers to the questions that are in the eGrant sub-application, which can basically give, a couple of sentences and then say, for more information, see attached scope of work narrative. That's super, because then you can really get into the nitty-gritty, and you don't repeat yourself over and over again, which the questions that the eGrant sub-application asks promotes people repeating themselves over and over again. And then for us reviewers, we often miss the differences between them. And so we miss some of the important stuff, and we'll go back to you and you'll say, well, it's in there, and then we'll have to go find it. Anyway, but photos, maps, the engineering reports, sometimes there's a community report about the need for improved health services and that improved emergency services or whatever, and that this particular project, by doing the retrofit, is going to help ensure that those facilities are available. I'm thinking more like tsunami relocation of clinics out of the tsunami area into high ground. That's a real critical need for a lot of communities. We'll go back to this, procedures for developing scopes of work. I'm not going to say this is the buy-all, end-all, do-all, but I'm going to say that there's some really interesting information here that if you've never done the scope of work for a drainage project, elevating a flood-prone structure, protective measures for utilities, etc., those scope of work examples have been developed. Some of them are several years old, but they're still good. They still give you a really good idea, and they'll give you so you can actually see what something looks like, and then you can build off of that and adapt it however you need to your own circumstances. The other little block is called engineering case studies, and these are all found at that web link I show above, application-development-1. Those engineering case studies, most of them were done, probably 15 years ago even, but you know what? They still have relevance, and there's still useful information in them. It's still worth going to the FEMA website and downloading those and using them as a reference point, okay? So the work schedule we've talked about. I wanted to mention, we talked about flood. We don't allow, for example, elevation projects or demolition of acquisition projects to occur during the flood season as determined by the local floodplain manager. If you have in-stream work and you're here in Oregon, Washington, or Idaho, and in some places in Alaska, you're limited to very specific, very narrow fish windows when you can actually put concrete pilings into a stream. And then obviously in Alaska, they have very seasonal limits during which materials can be brought in and during which construction can occur. Cost estimate and budget. So in eGrants, this is called the cost estimate. We would generally call it a budget, which is fine. It's the same thing. We understand it. But the important thing is that differentiates between a cost estimate and a budget is the budget sounds a little more final. Okay, like this is really what we're going to do. These are real hard numbers. Cost estimate is, well, an estimate. This is what we think it's going to cost. You know what? We're not going to hold you to this is what we think it's going to cost. If you think it's going to cost $5,247 to do project management for this grant, and in reality you found out that it went a heck of a lot easier, and it only cost $3,000, and you wanted to use those other $2,500 or so toward site improvements that were green infrastructure, we'd let you do it as long as those site improvements were included in the original scope of work and were reviewed through the environmental review process. So there's some flexibility because it's a cost estimate. It's not a contract. You'll do a contract many times to implement the project, but the application itself and the award is not fixed. So you need to identify the various costs. I'm mentioning here management costs. I think I've talked about this because this is a big boo-boo that a lot of people make. They forget to include the tribal staff time necessary to manage the project, okay? So those are eligible costs. Now, those costs may be your match, that's fine. But if they're not in the budget, you can't count them as match. So, let me repeat myself. If you want your tribal staff that are managing a project to be your 10% match or count toward your 10% match for a small Alaska Native village, those staff costs have to be included in the budget. FEMA's not going to pay for it, you're paying for it, but if they're not in the budget, you can't count them as match. Okay, there. I think maybe I've got my point across. Sorry. These are just things that I see happen all the time, and I'm trying to help you avoid something. Sub-applicant management. Okay, you're going to see this as you go through a sub-application. So if you were not the tribe, and maybe it's the city of Nespelem that's applying to the Colville Reservation for a PDMC grant that the Colville will then send into FEMA. The city of Nespelem says, well, I need financial administration costs covered for this. It's called sub-applicant management costs, and it's a 5% cap. So you take your total project cost of $100,000 and you get an additional $5,000 for sub-applicant management costs. And that is for your financial staff that pay the bills, draw down the money, file the quarterly reports, file the closeout package. Okay, so that's called administrative expenses. Okay, enough said on that. But for tribes, most of the tribe is your own sub-applicant, okay? So guess what? You get a lot bigger bang for your buck if you don't ask for sub-applicant management costs, but instead you ask for a management cost sub-grant award, which is 10% of your total project costs. But it's a separate sub-application from your project sub-application or from your planning sub-application if you're doing that as well. And that has to be completed, and that's where you can capture your indirect costs. You need document sources for your estimated costs. Most of the time, the documentation we're looking for is from an engineer's report, or it's from the Public Works Department or the Planning Department that has estimated how much it's going to cost to acquire the property. For example, if you're doing acquisition and restore the site, if you're doing an elevation, how much you might go out and get a contractor's estimate for that elevation, like we were talking about before, a ballpark. You would attach all of those reports that are provided to substantiate why you put $12,000 instead of $15,000 in the budget for that, okay? There's some things that we don't get quite so picky on. You know, you don't have to say, well, it costs 5 cents per pencil and I'm going to need 10 pencils. You just put in a supply amount of maybe $400 or $500 or whatever, you estimate. We're not going to ask for backup on supplies. We will ask for backup on equipment, because equipment is any expense charged to a federal grant that is a piece of operating stuff, like a computer or a plotter, or maybe you need some surveying equipment because this is going to be a long, complicated project and you have to have that, and it costs more than $5,000. That has to be reported as equipment, and we do need to know where you got the price for that. We also need to know if you're claiming, if you're going to put in that your construction costs are $1 million. We need to see the detailed construction cost estimate. If you're going to have staff from the tribe that are providing the match and doing the project management, we're going to need their salary and fringe rate. And if you've got a couple of them, you know, you can give us a spreadsheet and combine them all together, but there needs to be, we're not going to ask you to provide some sort of proof from the financial system that this is this person's dollarly hour rate and that we'll accept what you say, but it does have to be broken down by the personnel that are involved. Budget narrative is required to describe all of this stuff and how it relates to implementing the scope of work. So that's where you can include who's actually going to be doing the project management, who's going to be doing the financial management, you're going to contract engineering out, you're going to contract out construction, but you're going to do, but the tribal public works is going to do this site work. All that goes into your budget narrative. Budget narrative is really critical, is usually forgotten. There's no place to put it. Guess what, folks? There's no place to put your detailed cost estimate. So you go to the next screen, which is cost share, and you attach all your cost-related documents into cost share, and that will work just fine. Or you can go down to the section that's called comments and attachments and upload it there. Anyway, I thought I'd mention that. Again, helpful hints this week as we go along. I guess one thing I did want to mention is that sometimes, because we get asked this, permits cost money, inspection costs money. If the tribe donates the inspection cost, so let's say you have your own building department and you're doing your own building inspection. If you donate the cost of the permits and the cost of doing the inspections, that's fine. That's cash. That's your match, included in your budget, and therefore you get credit for it when you submit your match documentation. And then the other thing is mobilization and site preparation. That's typically included in a construction bid. Just wanted to assure you that we recognize that that's necessary in order to do the project. Demob is also necessary. Okay, contingency costs. Ooh, this is a bad one. Okay, so I've been doing grants since 1998. It wasn't until last year that we were allowed to include contingency costs as a cost line item, or I should say in 2015. But it had a really big hook. Sounded like a wonderful carrot, but it had a really big hook. You had to literally come back to FEMA and do an award amendment to use any of those contingency costs for any of the direct cost line items in your budget. What a royal pain, what a royal hassle, and I will say it's a huge hassle for FEMA too. So we encourage all of our tribes, all of our states, all of our local governments to do what we used to do for a long time. Include an inflation factor in the expenses that you know are going to be higher by the time you get your award. So even though you provide us a detailed cost estimate, you specifically state in your budget narrative that we also inflated it for 2 years based on our local inflation construction cost rate of 12%, which is probably what it is here in Puget Sound. And that's fine. That's what you need. We just need to know where that came from. You roll it into the direct cost line item. And then you don't have to come back to FEMA every time you want to move money from that contingency cost to the, because most of contingency cost is inflation, okay? This is the budget information sheet for construction programs from OMB in the grants.gov family of forms of SF 424C construction budget. Notice it has one line for construction. We don't need to know how many nails. We don't need to know how much concrete. We don't need to know how much steel. We don't need to know how many 2x4s. That's all really good in that detailed engineer's cost estimate that you're probably going to get from your engineer, and you're going to attach it into eGrants, but it doesn't go into the eGrants cost line item budget. What you use to input data into the eGrants cost line item budget are these line items, and then you attach your detailed budget to eGrants. Let me tell you, it just works so much better. It's so much easier to administer, because guess what? Our grants people tell our tribal and state grantees that they have to monitor every cost line item in the project. So if you put 2x4s as a cost line item and bolts and nails as another cost line item, they are going to ask for documentation of how many 2x4s and how many bolts and nails were used during this quarterly period for which you are submitting a reimbursement request. You do not want to have to do that. You just want to say, we spent $17,483 on construction costs this month. That's what you need to know, okay? Cool. So the other thing is I wiped out contingencies in my lovely little strikeout, and I emphasized the construction costs. Now, I will tell you that administrative and legal expenses includes both the project management costs and the administrative management costs. That's the only place to put them. So in your budget narrative, clearly describe the difference between the two. Otherwise, our grant programs division will say, oh my God, they have more than 5% in their administrative and legal expenses category. That's a violation. No, it's not, as long as you explained why it's more than 5%, because you have 7% project management costs and 5% financial administration costs for a total of 12%. That's legit. You just have to tell us, okay? Here's a couple of examples of budget and budget narratives. You know, these are not real, they're not hard. They're not hard to do. I will tell you that if your budget narrative is more than four pages long, it's probably too long. You went into too much detail. But this, and you can include tables like this. You can include little clips of Excel spreadsheets. You can attach an Excel spreadsheet of personnel to your tab. Here's another example. So it's talking about what the engineering fees are all about, what the city administration fees, what the equipment costs are, etc. Pre-award costs. This is something a lot of people don't even realize they get credit for. You can also get credit for this as your match, okay? But if it's not in the budget, you don't get credit for it. Everything that you want to use as match to your project has to be included in the budget. And then in the budget narrative, you just explain, oh, that's a match cost line item. No problem. Or this portion of it is a match. So for pre-award costs, you can do a lot of stuff after the application period opened on October 1st. And all of those expenses related to putting this project together, putting the application together, engineering report, the BCA, etc., all that counts as pre-award costs. And you just have to put them in. So in e-grants, whoops, other direction. Okay, so in e-grants, it's not going to stop you at just putting in those 15 cost line items or whatever, okay? I have seen one city put in the seismic retrofit with the nuts and bolts and 2x4s. It was 4 8.5 by 11 printout pages long. Okay, but in e-grants, you will have pre-award architectural and engineering fees and post-award architectural and engineering fees. Two separate cost line items. You have to put that pre-award in and identify it as pre-award. And then if it's the same as another cost line item, then you put in that other cost line item as the post-award. So you're going to have pre-award administrative and legal expenses, project development costs, application costs. You may have other architectural and engineering fees, maybe your benefit cost analysis that you prepared, or maybe you hired an environmental firm to do a draft analysis of the environmental impacts of that particular project and pull together a lot of documentation for the FEMA team to use in their review. That's huge. But you get credit for it. You get reimbursed for it, or you get match credit for it. Either way, it has to be in there and has to be identified as pre-award. When you submit those pre-award costs in e-grants at the time of application, you can change them prior to award. With complicated projects, there's a lot of times that there's additional time spent, or even planning grants. There's more time spent by the tribal staff working with FEMA in that period between the time the project is selected, we call it post-selection, pre-award, before the award occurs. You can literally, prior to award, ask FEMA, we want to claim another $15,000 worth of expenses because that's how much it's taken to work on all of these post-selection pre-award issues. We will release your budget back to you, allow you to put those cost line items in and change them so that when we make the award, you have FEMA approval of all of those pre-award costs. Okay?
A quick question from the audience about where either those total costs go or where in-kind and match go as far as column A and column B.
Okay. They all go into column A. Yeah, column A rolls from the column C. And why I say that column B is not your match. It's costs that aren't allowable. So they don't get counted. You don't get credit for them, and they don't count toward what FEMA's going to reimburse either. Now, what most tribes do is they create their own spreadsheet that has a column A of this is what we hope the feds pay for, and a column B of this is what we intend to provide as match. You can provide that as part of your, and we encourage you to do that, as part of that budget narrative backup documentation, because then we have a clear understanding of where the match is coming from. But for e-grants, e-grants only knows, and the OMB budget form only knows eligible costs. It's all that are going to show up in your award. So if you were to say, if you were to put your match, let's say you have $100,000 project, $75,000 fed, $25,000 tribal, and you were to put your match cost was $25,000 in B, SF-424 and E-grants, and your $75,000 for federal costs in A, column C is only going to show the federal cost. It's going to skip over everything in the middle and come down as the total allowable cost. So if your project cost was $100,000 and you put in your match as $25,000 in column B, column C would deduct it. And you would get a project grant award for $75,000 instead of for $100,000. That makes sense? Okay. The budget's super, super important, so working with me, okay. There we go. Non-federal match. Someone was thinking ahead, and I'm really glad that we have an opportunity to talk about this a little bit more. Here's some typical things that we see and we encourage tribes to consider as their match. Again, the typical PDM grant is 75 fed, 25 non-fed. Many tribes, even small tribes, that have substantial casino disbursements on an annual basis don't meet the small and impoverished threshold, because small and impoverished is 3,000 people or less, 10% below the per capita income national level for that particular year, and 1 percentage point higher in unemployment rate. So for match, a lot of times the project management by the tribal staff, that can be your match. Financial management, that can be your match, but if it's not in the budget, you don't get to claim it as match, even though, so it's basically you're providing the service for free. You're doing it anyway, put it in the budget, because then you get credit for it on match column. Staff and volunteer time to conduct community outreach, community meetings. In-kind donations. Time is an in-kind donation if it is provided by someone who is not employed by the tribe. So anyone who is employed by the tribe or is an officer of the tribe, like an elected official, they have an hourly rate that is, a lot of people call that in-kind match, but it's really cash match because it came out of your general fund. That's the original derivation, so it's a cash match. Match commitment letter is required from the tribal board or executive. I talked about that. Typically that's often done when the authorized agent is established. That's a really easy thing to do it all together in one place. And it doesn't have to be a specific, I would encourage you not to do a specific dollar amount. I would encourage you, the board, to say maybe you cap it at up to $50,000, but whatever it is, it's way over what you think you're going to need. And you can say in that match commitment letter, the bulk of the commitment or all of the commitment may be in terms of the time and effort provided by and services provided by tribal staff employees.
Continued in the next section.